She sailed to the island she had inherited and saw rails running straight across the sea. She followed them and discovered what her aunt had been hiding for many years. Look where they led. Subscribe, and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The day of the funeral stayed with Anna longer than she expected, clinging to her memory like the thin crust of snow that refused to melt on the church steps. She had not seen her Aunt Lisa in more than a decade, and yet, as she stood in the nearly empty chapel, watching the snow-heavy sky through the narrow windows, she felt the weight of something unfinished settling on her shoulders. 3 people attended the burial: the priest, a woman from the care home, and Anna. It struck her as profoundly unfair that a woman who had lived with such restless energy, whose mind had always burned toward the impossible, would depart with so little ceremony. The priest spoke gently about perseverance, about quiet lives that mattered in unseen ways, but the words drifted past Anna like cold air. She had come out of duty, not sentiment, or so she told herself. She had come because someone had to. After the burial, the lawyer, a thin, nervous man who kept adjusting his glasses, gestured for her to follow him to a cramped office next to the chapel. He cleared his throat several times before handing her an envelope marked with her name in her aunt's sharp, unmistakable handwriting. Inside was the formal letter. Lisa had left Anna a small island off the northern coast, a piece of land so insignificant most maps didn't bother naming it. Along with it came a simple instruction. Before deciding what to do with the property, Anna had to visit it in person and spend at least one night in the house that stood there. Her first reaction was incredulity. An island. She tried to picture the last conversation she'd had with her aunt, a rushed exchange after a family gathering, both of them tired, promising vaguely to call and never doing so. It had never occurred to her that Lisa would think of her in her will, let alone trust her with something as strange and impractical as an island. The lawyer watched her carefully, as though expecting an argument or refusal, but Anna only nodded, slipped the papers into her bag, and left the office with the cold wind pushing at her back. 2 days later, she found herself driving north along a narrow highway bordered by dark forests and pockets of frozen marshland. The further she went, the more the world seemed to empty itself out. Houses grew scarce, small towns appeared and disappeared in minutes, and the sky hung low and heavy, as though weighed down by all the unsaid things that had followed her since the funeral. She had spoken to no one about the inheritance. It felt like something that belonged to her alone, an unresolved thread woven through her life without her noticing. When she reached the port, she almost turned back. The town consisted of a handful of weather-beaten buildings crouched near the shoreline, their windows fogged by sea air. Nets hung from wooden posts, like abandoned cobwebs. A few men in thick coats watched her unload her bags, their expressions half curious, half amused, as though they guessed she was here for something unusual. One of them, a fisherman with a scar beneath his eye, nodded toward her rental car. "You heading to one of the outer rocks?" he asked. She hesitated before answering that she was going to the island left to her by her aunt. At the mention of the name L. Larson, the fisherman let out a short laugh, not unkind, but edged with something that made Anna's stomach tighten. "Your aunt. She had ideas," he said. "Tried to build a road across the sea. People talked about it for years." Anna frowned, assuming he was exaggerating or speaking metaphorically, but he only shrugged and gestured toward the water. "If you're going to her island, you'll see. Hard to miss." The man directed her to an older fisherman named Oscar, who still made trips to the outer islands when weather allowed. Oscar agreed to take her, though he eyed her luggage and city boots with clear skepticism. As they loaded her bags onto the small boat, the wind picked up, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of winter waves. The air felt as though it had been filtered through ice. The boat pushed off with a lurch, and the mainland began to shrink behind them. The sea spread out like a sheet of hammered steel, its surface shifting under streaks of pale light. Anna pulled her coat tighter and tried to steady her thoughts, but the motion of the boat and the vastness of the cold horizon made her feel small and untethered. Oscar said little, steering with movements that suggested he knew the currents intimately. Occasionally he muttered something about the tides or the wind, but mostly he remained silent. As the boat cut deeper into the fog, Anna began to doubt the wisdom of coming alone. She imagined the island as a bare rock, the house a collapsing hut filled with drafts and dust. But then the fog thinned, and she leaned forward, preparing to see the shoreline. What she saw instead stole the breath from her lungs. A line of rails rose out of the water, 2 narrow strips of steel suspended above the surface on slender metal piles driven deep into the sea floor. The structure stretched outward from the direction where the island should be, reaching dozens, perhaps hundreds of meters into the open sea. It looked impossible, like the beginning of a bridge that had never been finished, or the remains of some abandoned industrial dream. The rails glinted under a thin coating of frost, their edges sharp and clean, despite the rust that clung to the support beams. It was a sight both haunting and beautiful, as though someone had tried to carve a straight line across a living, shifting world. "That's what she built," Oscar said quietly, noticing Anna's expression. "Or tried to." "You're serious," Anna whispered. He nodded. "Your aunt said people shouldn't be trapped on the islands in winter. No boats, no ferries. She wanted a train. A small one, maybe just a cart at first. But a way to cross. She got farther than anyone expected." Anna stared at the rails, trying to imagine her aunt alone in the freezing wind, welding pipes and hammering beams, while storms gathered over the horizon. She had always been stubborn, but this was something else entirely. It was not eccentricity. It was vision, ambition, the kind of determination that burned even when the world laughed at it. The boat circled toward the island, a small, dark shape rising from the water, like a sleeping animal curled beneath the sky. The house appeared a moment later, a simple wooden structure standing above the shoreline, its roof bowed under the weight of accumulated snow. A thin trail of smoke curled from the chimney. At first, Anna thought she imagined it, but then she realized it was only a trick of the gray sky shifting behind the structure. They docked at a narrow wooden landing, and Oscar helped her unload her bags. He looked toward the island with something between caution and respect. "She spent a lot of time here," he said. "More than people knew." "Did anyone ever come to help her?" Anna asked. "Not after the first year," he replied. "People said she was stubborn. Maybe she was. But she did what she believed in." After he left, taking the boat back into the fog, Anna stood alone on the island. The silence felt enormous, broken only by the rhythmic tapping of frozen branches against the house and the distant hum of the rails as the wind moved across them. She took a slow breath, feeling the cold fill her lungs, then walked toward the house. Inside, the air was surprisingly clean, as though someone had aired the place recently. The walls were lined with shelves cluttered with tools, notebooks, tin containers, and rolled blueprints. A chair sat beside the window, and a heavy wool blanket hung over it, the fabric worn in places where hands had grasped it. She set her bags down and began exploring the room, drawn to the papers that littered the table. What she found there changed everything. The blueprints were marked with her aunt's writing-precise measurements, diagrams, annotations, calculations that Anna could not fully understand, but recognized as the work of someone who took engineering seriously. There were sketches of load-bearing structures, notes on wave patterns, even summaries of coastal erosion studies. And at the bottom of one page, written in a careful hand, Version 1, Preliminary. We'll build. We'll test. We'll prove it possible. Another note in red ink. They laugh because they don't see what I see. But the sea is not an enemy. It simply needs to be understood. Anna felt a tremor run through her as she traced the letters with her fingertips. Her aunt had not been chasing a fantasy. She had been designing a solution. A bold one, a difficult one, but a real one. The rails were not the relic of a delusion. They were the foundation of an idea that might have changed the lives of everyone who lived on these scattered islands. She continued reading late into the night, piecing together fragments of Lisa's struggle. The rejections from funding committees, the ridicule from townspeople, the countless setbacks inflicted by storms. Yet through it all, her aunt persevered, sometimes alone, sometimes with brief help from others who drifted in and out of the project. The final pages of one notebook described the exhaustion of working through winter, her hands cracked and bleeding from cold, yet still writing. If I don't finish, maybe someone else will. No dream is wasted if it leaves a trace. Those words held Anna in place for a long time. She closed the notebook slowly, feeling something inside her shift, as though the room had refocused itself around her. The house was no longer a forgotten relic on a forgotten island. It was the heart of her aunt's life, pulsing with all the energy she had poured into her impossible dream. As the wind rattled the windows and the rails outside hummed softly under the weight of the night air, Anna felt a sense of connection she had not expected, something close to responsibility, and something even closer to the early stirrings of purpose. She lay awake for hours, listening to the distant sea as though it carried her aunt's unfinished voice. She had come to the island out of obligation, but she understood now. She would not be leaving so easily. Morning arrived quietly on the island, though arrived felt like too strong a word for the way the sky merely lightened from black to a softer shade of charcoal. Anna had slept poorly, wrapped in layers of blankets that still couldn't stop the drafts that slipped through the floorboards and doorframe. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faint outline of the rails stretching out across the water, gleaming under the moon as if calling her. When she finally rose, her limbs felt heavy, not from the physical cold, but from the weight of everything she had read the night before. The house was still, holding its breath along with her, and the only sound was the restless scrape of wind against the wooden siding. She made tea on the old stove, watching the kettle tremble slightly with each gust of wind. When she stepped outside, the air bit into her skin with an intensity that woke every nerve in her body. She stood on the porch for a long moment, taking in the sight of the island under its winter shroud. The uneven terrain, the scattered rocks covered in frost, the way the snow clung to the wire fence near the edge of the property. And beyond all of it, the rails rose again, catching the pale morning light. From a distance, they looked almost delicate, like some skeletal sculpture rising from the sea. But up close, as she discovered when she approached them, they were anything but fragile. The metal beams bracing them were thick, and though rust had invaded many joints, it had not eaten away the solid core beneath. She ran her glove along the length of the top rail, feeling the ridges where the welds had melted and hardened again. Some seams were expertly done, almost seamless. Others were rough, uneven, the work of someone who had welded through bitter winds, failing light, and tired hands. The tide was low, revealing the bases of the metal piles driven deep into the seabed. Seaweed clung to them in dark, frozen tangles, and the edges of the steel looked chewed by years of waves. She stepped farther along the rails, testing each foot placement. For the first few meters, the structure was close enough to shore that the height didn't intimidate her. But as she walked, the water beneath grew deeper, the space wider, the sound of waves louder. When she finally stopped, she looked back and saw the island shrinking behind her, the house a pale speck on the snowy ground. A sense of awe settled over her. Her aunt had built this her hands, her stubbornness, her relentless mind. No one else. It struck Anna as profoundly lonely work, and yet powerful in a way she had never understood before. She spent the next hour walking along the rails, then returning to shore to examine the piles of tools, buckets of bolts, coils of metal wire, and a small generator stored near the house. Some items were rusted and ruined, others perfectly preserved beneath tarps and layers of plastic. She wondered how often her aunt had come here in her final years, tending to these pieces of machinery, guarding them like parts of a living organism. Later, when the cold forced her back indoors, she sat again at the table covered in blueprints. She leafed through them with more care this time, trying to see not only the technical details, but the story they hinted at. Some sheets showed early designs, almost playful, with notes like, "Too light will snap under first storm," or "Test alternative alloy." Others were far more sophisticated, with layering techniques she recognized from architectural textbooks. The handwriting varied from neat and controlled to frantic and slanted, sometimes drifting into the margins when ideas outpaced the space available. She found letters, dozens of them, in folders tucked behind the stove. They were responses from engineering firms, maritime authorities, funding committees. Each one rejected her aunt's proposal in a slightly different tone, overly sympathetic, dismissive, bureaucratic, or openly mocking. And in each, the same message repeated: impractical, unsafe, unrealistic, unnecessary. One, written by a coastal planner, had scrawled in red ink across the bottom: "You're trying to build a road through the ocean. It's not a metaphor. It's madness." Yet none of this had stopped Lisa. If anything, the rejection letters seemed to grow more frequent during the years when the rails progressed the most. But the most haunting discovery came when Anna opened a notebook bound in cracked leather, thicker than the rest. Inside were logs dated entries extending over nearly 15 years. Some were short, just lines about weather patterns or metal fatigue. Others were pages of reflection and worry and fierce determination. There were entries describing the two students who had helped at the beginning, fresh out of university, their idealism briefly aligning with Lisa's dream before fear and exhaustion drove them away. One entry described a storm that struck without warning, tearing down an entire section of rails and nearly pulling one of the students into the sea. "He quit the next day," Lisa had written. "I don't blame him. The sea always tests us. What matters is whether we return." Later entries were lonelier. The handwriting grew smaller, more cramped. She wrote about waking up with numb fingers, about welding alone under moonlight, about hearing the laughter of locals drifting from the harbor when she went to town for supplies. "They think I'm a ghost," she wrote once, "a story to tell newcomers. But ghosts don't build. I build." As Anna read, she felt each line settling deeper into her, reshaping her understanding of the woman she had dismissed as eccentric. These were not the thoughts of a delusional dreamer. They were the thoughts of someone who believed that even the smallest life could carve meaning into the world, if only she kept going long enough. In the afternoon, wanting perspective beyond the pages, Anna returned to the mainland. The ride back with Oscar was silent again, though now she sensed curiosity beneath his stern quiet. She told him she had questions, and he nodded, agreeing to wait while she spoke to others in the village. The town's only cafe was dimly lit, warmed by a small stove at the center. Fishermen gathered around worn tables, their conversation falling quiet when Anna entered. She approached the counter, where an older woman with silver hair was wiping down cups. When Anna mentioned her aunt's name, the woman's expression softened. "Lisa," she murmured. "Your aunt was brave. People didn't say that out loud often. But she was." Across the room, one of the younger men snorted. brave? She tried to build a railway for ghosts. She tried to build something for us, the older woman corrected sharply. You'd know that if you'd ever had to miss a school term because the ferry froze. More stories followed. Some townspeople mocked Lisa's project as a doomed fantasy. Others remembered her trudging through snow in thick boots, hauling supplies across the docks. A few recalled how she spoke passionately about the winter months when islanders were cut off, unable to reach hospitals, work, or even groceries, without risking their lives on thin ice. She believed that this place mattered, the silver-haired woman said, more than anyone else ever did. When Anna left the cafe, she found Oscar waiting by the boat. He studied her face and seemed to understand what she was feeling even without words. She wasn't mad, he said, just ahead of her time. The boat ride back cleared her thoughts. Snowflakes drifted across the water, dissolving on the cold surface. The rails loomed again when they reached the island, stark and silent under the fading light. She stepped off the boat and felt something shift inside her, a sense of direction, perhaps, or recognition. Back inside the house, she continued exploring the room until she noticed a loose board in the floor beneath the desk. Curious, she pried it up, revealing a shallow compartment lined with cloth. Inside lay a metal case, heavy and sealed with rusted latches. She carried it to the table, wiped dust from its surface, and opened it carefully. Inside were rolled documents bound with ribbon, a stack of detailed diagrams, and a final notebook with a rigid cover. The first page held her aunt's handwriting, more fragile than in earlier journals. For whoever finds this is version 3, stronger, smarter, closer to possible. The designs inside were breathtaking, far more advanced than the earlier ones. They showed reinforced piles, flexible joints designed to withstand winter drift, calculated load limits, and materials marked with notes about new alloys she had researched. It was the work of someone who had grown more skilled with time, not less. Someone whose mind had not decayed, but sharpened. As Anna turned the pages, she realized she had been wrong about so many things, not just about her aunt, but about the assumptions she had carried into her adult life. She had always believed that dreams faded when the world pushed back hard enough. Yet here was proof that some dreams hardened instead, becoming more determined each time they were doubted. She sat for a long time with the last notebook open before her, feeling the weight of it press into her palms. The storm outside intensified, wind battering the windows, but she barely noticed. The rails hummed faintly, vibrating through the walls as though recalling every step her aunt had taken on them. When she finally rose, she felt changed rooted, not just in the island, but in the history written across it. She stepped out again into the snow, drawn once more to the silhouette of the rails. The wind howled, but she walked toward them anyway, compelled by a force she could not yet name. She stood at their base, eyes tracing the line that stretched into the dimming horizon. She could almost imagine her aunt standing exactly where she was now, staring into the same endless winter sea with the same stubborn fire in her chest. And in that moment, Anna understood that the island was not simply a place her aunt had left behind. It was a message, a plea, a question waiting for an answer. She touched the cold metal rail and whispered into the wind, though she didn't know why or to whom. I see it now. And somewhere within her, as the night closed in, she felt the first quiet spark of resolve. The storm that had rolled in overnight left the island wrapped in a heavy stillness the next morning. When Anna woke, the world outside her window looked almost unfamiliar. An expanse of muted white and blue, where the sea met the sky in a seamless horizon. Snow clung to the railings outside the cottage, cushioning every sound and turning the coastline into something soft and untouched. For a moment she lay motionless, listening to the muffled quiet, the faint ticking of the stove cooling in the next room, and the steady rhythm of her own breathing. It felt as if the entire island was holding itself very still, waiting for her to rise and continue what she had begun yesterday among her aunt's scattered papers. She dressed slowly, her muscles stiff from the cold and from the uneasy sleep that had followed her long night of reading. Her mind returned again and again to the image of her aunt, standing proudly beside the first rails, smiling into the wind, as if she could already see the finished line stretching across the sea. It was a version of Liza she had never known in life, a woman full of fire, pushing against the stubborn weight of the world. And yet, in the dim light of morning, Anna felt as though she was beginning to understand her in a way she never had before. When she stepped outside, the cold hit her with a sharp, bracing force, filling her lungs with air that felt both painful and cleansing. The sky was a pale gray dome above her, streaked with the remnants of the storm. But the wind had calmed, and the sea moved in gentle, rhythmic heaves along the rocky shore. She walked toward the rails without fully deciding to, her feet following the same instinctive pull that had led her there the morning before. As she approached the edge of the island, the rails appeared once again, rising like an apparition from the fog, their long, thin beams stretching out over the water with the same quiet defiance that had startled her on her first day here. In daylight, they looked even more fragile, as though one strong wave would be enough to snap them and send the entire structure crashing beneath the surface. Yet, as she examined them more closely, she saw the truth her aunt must have known from the beginning. The beams were corroded by time, but not weakened. The joints were rusted, but still solid. The foundations, though weathered, had been anchored deep into the stone bed beneath the island with a precision that spoke of skill, not madness. Liza had built the first segment of her dream with her own 2 hands, or at least with whatever help she could muster, before the world turned its back on her. Anna walked slowly along the rocky path parallel to the rails, her boots crunching through crusted snow. The sea below whispered against the supports, sending up occasional bursts of icy spray that caught the morning light. She paused when she reached the point where the rails extended farthest, the last section before the water deepened to a darker, more unknowable blue. Here the structure ended abruptly, the final support beam standing alone like a sentinel watching the empty horizon. Beyond it lay nothing but open sea and the faint promise of clouds gathering on the edge of the world. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine what her aunt must have felt the day she stopped building here. Had she stood in this very spot, looking out at the endless ocean, believing with absolute certainty that she would return with more supplies, more funds, more strength? Or had she known somewhere deep inside that this was as far as she would get? The thought tugged at Anna's chest with a strange ache. She wished she could ask her. She wished she could hear Liza's voice now, explaining everything she had hoped for, everything she had fought for, everything she had lost. The wind picked up slightly, brushing past her with a low sigh and carrying the faint scent of iron and salt. It was then that she noticed something unusual beneath the rails, half buried among the rocks, a rectangular wooden crate, its surface warped by moisture and age. She knelt and brushed the snow away, revealing a faded stencil across the lid. SR Wee1. C-Rail, the initials Liza had used in her notes. Her pulse quickened. She found a loose stone and pried the lid open with slow, cautious pressure. The hinges, though rusted, gave way with a dull groan. Inside the crate, wrapped in layers of oilcloth, lay several metal clamps, bolts, a small hand drill, and a folded tarp that smelled faintly of old machinery. Underneath these tools lay something even more curious, a stack of waterproof notebooks identical to the one she had already found inside the cottage. She lifted the top one carefully and opened it. The pages were filled with diagrams of the ocean currents around the island, calculations about load distribution, sketches of experimental support designs. The handwriting was firm, unwavering. Anna recognized the steady movement of letters. Her aunt had been working out here right until the end. One page in particular caught her attention. It was dated only a few months before Liza's death. The ink had run slightly, as though the notebook had been exposed to light rain, but the words remained legible. Tested the reinforced supports again. The new model is stable. If I can get the supplies before winter sets in, I can extend the line another 50 meters. The dream isn't dead. Not yet. Anna read the line 3 times before closing the notebook and pressing it against her chest. Something inside her shifted then, a quiet but resolute certainty that she hadn't expected to feel. This dream, this impossible dream, was not madness. It was not the whim of a lonely woman or the misguided ambition of a stubborn engineer. It was something that had been built with clarity, with vision, with determination. And now, for reasons she had only begun to understand, it had been placed into her hands. She remained there for a long time, listening to the creak of the beams and the soft whisper of waves beneath her. The island around her seemed larger, fuller, as though the rails themselves were drawing breath again. When she finally stood and began making her way back to the cottage, the cold no longer felt as sharp. Her steps were steadier, her heartbeat calmer, though her mind raced with thoughts she couldn't yet untangle. Inside, she lit the stove again and laid the crate's contents out on the table. There was no denying it anymore. Liza had been preparing to continue the line. She had designed new supports, refined the design, planned for expansion. But something had stopped her. Illness, perhaps, or the unyielding strain of age. Whatever the reason, the last steps of her work had been left unfinished, not by choice, but by time itself. As the afternoon deepened into a muted winter evening, Anna sat at the table with her hands clasped around a warm mug. The cottage seemed charged with a quiet energy she hadn't noticed before, as if the air itself held layers of memory waiting to be uncovered. She opened one of the notebooks again, letting her eyes skim across the equations, the sketches, the brief but determined notes. She could almost hear her aunt's voice in the margins, urging her forward, pulsing with the same relentless drive that had carried her through years of ridicule and loneliness. At some point, the thought formed slowly in Anna's mind, so quietly that she didn't realize she had settled into it until she was already nodding to herself. If she truly wanted to honor her aunt's memory, if she wanted to understand who Liza had been beyond the thin, awkward family exchanges, she would have to do more than simply sort through the remnants of her life. She would have to step into the dream Liza had left behind. She would have to continue what had been started, or at least try. The idea frightened her as much as it filled her with a strange, electric excitement. She had never built anything like this in her life. She wasn't an engineer or a planner or a visionary. She was just a woman who had drifted through her life without ever anchoring herself to something solid, something meaningful. And now she stood at the threshold of something immense and unfinished. As night finally settled, she set the notebooks aside, blew out the lantern, and climbed into bed. The cold crept slowly through the cottage again, but she barely felt it. Her thoughts were drifting toward tomorrow, toward what she might discover next, toward what the rails had been trying to tell her since the moment she first laid eyes on them rising from the sea. Outside, the wind shifted, brushing over the island with a soft, steady murmur. The sound seemed almost like a whisper, like an invitation carried across the snow. Anna closed her eyes and listened to it with a strange feeling of recognition. Somewhere beyond the dark horizon, past the ice, And the waves, her aunt's dream still waited, unfinished, but not forgotten. Not anymore. The following morning rose with a strange metallic quiet, the kind that settles over the sea when the air grows colder than the water itself. Anna awoke before sunrise, though she couldn't remember drifting into sleep at all. Her mind had been working through the night, turning over thoughts and half-formed intentions like pieces of driftwood caught in the tide. When she finally sat up, the cottage felt smaller than it had the night before, as though the walls had drawn inward while she slept, nudging her toward a decision she had not yet spoken, even to herself. She dressed slowly, layering sweaters beneath her coat, pulling thick socks over numb feet. The stove's fire had long gone out, leaving the air sharp and brittle. As she stepped outside, her breath billowed into the dawn like steam rising from a hidden spring. Everything beyond the porch was white and silent. Snow had fallen again during the night, smoothing the landscape into a blank slate, broken only by the jagged dark line of the rails stretching toward the sea. For a long moment, she simply stood there, watching the rails glow faintly in the early light, their metal edges kissed by the faintest hint of rose-colored dawn. She found herself walking toward them almost before she realized it, boots sinking into fresh snow with soft, muffled thuds. The air tasted of salt and frost, and each inhale felt like swallowing something clean and electric. The sea below moved lazily, dark waves rolling beneath a crust of fragile ice near the shore. The rails rose steadily above it, beckoning her with a silent insistence that felt almost alive. As she approached the platform where the rails began, she felt a tremor of anticipation ripple through her. Not excitement exactly, but something heavier, something threaded with fear and longing. She placed her hand on the nearest beam. The cold metal bit through her glove, but she didn't pull away. She followed the line of the rail with her gaze, tracing its path out toward the horizon, where sea and sky blended into a soft, pale blur. It was then that she noticed something she had overlooked before. Faint, almost invisible marks scratched into the metal, weathered by years of storms. She leaned closer, brushing away a thin layer of frost, revealing initials carved in a small, slanted script. L.C. The letters were shallow, but unmistakable. Her aunt had stood here once, her hand gripping this very railing, carving her presence into the steel, as though marking the beginning of her journey. Anna traced the letters with her fingertip. The touch made something deep inside her tighten and warm at the same time. The rails no longer felt like an artifact or a relic. They felt like a conversation. A link. A bridge, not just across the sea, but across years of silence and distance that had stretched between her and the woman who had left her this island. She walked along the side of the rails until she reached the place where the final support beam stood alone against the sea. The height here was dizzying. The drop beneath her was steep, the waves dark and cold as iron. She hesitated before stepping onto the narrow maintenance plank that ran beside the beginning of the unfinished extension. It had been built for workers, if there had ever been any besides Liza, but it looked precarious now, worn and slick with ice. Still, Anna stepped onto it, gripping a vertical brace to steady herself. She moved carefully, each breath measured, each step deliberate. The plank creaked beneath her weight, protesting softly, but held. At the farthest point, she stopped and looked out over the water. Here, above the deepest stretch of sea, the rails felt almost sacred. She could almost imagine what her aunt had seen. Vast possibility. A line drawn from hope into the unknown. The kind of vision that made one willing to build and rebuild through storms, through loneliness, through the cruel laughter of those who couldn't see beyond their own shores. When she finally tore her gaze away, she glanced down at the base of the beam, where snow had gathered in uneven piles. Something dark protruded from the drift metal, perhaps wood. She crouched carefully, cleared the snow away, and discovered a small, rusted box, its latch frozen shut. With effort, she pried it open. Inside were several laminated sheets, stiff and cold, their edges curled from age and damp. They contained a detailed structural analysis. Calculations, sketches, and handwritten notes in the same bold script she had come to recognize. But one sheet made her breath catch. It was dated only weeks before Liza had died. Test successful. The final support model is strong enough. If the weather holds, I can begin the new segment in spring. If not, then whoever comes after me must decide what the sea deserves. Anna read the line several times, the words sinking slowly into her. Whoever comes after me. Her aunt had known, or hoped, or wished. The knowledge made her heart ache with a mix of grief and gratitude so sharp she had to close her eyes for a moment. Later, when she returned to the cottage with the rusted box tucked under her arm, she felt a new tightness in her chest. Not fear, not sorrow, but purpose. She placed the box on the table beside the notebooks and unfolded the laminated sheets. The diagrams were more advanced than anything she had seen so far, iterations of the rail design made stronger, more flexible, more suited to the brutality of winter seas. Her aunt had been learning, improving, evolving the dream. And now the dream had reached her, not ruined, but paused, waiting. She spent hours studying the notes, cross-referencing the formulas with the diagrams, tracing the lines of force distribution across the beams. It was not easy work. She had never been an engineer, never dealt with the mathematics of ocean structures, but the more she read, the more she understood. The logic was there, buried in symbols and sketches, revealed slowly through her aunt's steady, determined hand. And beneath the logic, there was something else, an emotional architecture just as intricate and stubborn as the metal beams rising from the sea. As afternoon settled into the fragile light of early evening, Anna pushed back from the table and stood slowly. Her eyes were tired, her fingers stiff, but something inside her felt sharper than it had in years. She stepped outside again, letting the cold evening air fill her lungs. The horizon was turning the faintest shade of lavender, and the rails glinted with a soft glow, as if responding to the fading sun. She followed the path toward the shore, her boots crunching with each step. When she reached the beginning of the rails, she stopped and stared out over the water. The sea was calm, and the silence felt almost reverent. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the cold wind brush against her cheeks, letting the smell of salt and snow ground her. And then, without speaking aloud, without writing anything down, she made her decision. She would continue the project. Not out of obligation, not out of guilt, not even entirely out of love for the woman she wished she had known better, but because the dream felt larger than its creator, because the rails rising from the sea were no longer just an unfinished idea. They were a testament, a question, a challenge that resonated with something inside her she had not realized was waiting to be awakened. She turned away from the shore and began walking back to the cottage, her steps sure and steady despite the shifting snow. She felt the weight of what she had chosen settle onto her shoulders, but it was not a burden. It was a cloak, a mantle. And as the light faded and the first stars emerged above the quiet winter sea, she felt, for the first time in years, that she was exactly where she needed to be. When she reached the cottage, she paused at the door and looked back once more at the silhouette of the rails, stark and beautiful against the darkening horizon. They no longer seemed like a relic of someone else's impossible dream. They seemed like the beginning of her own. and somewhere deep in the stillness of the island, she felt an echo faint but unmistakable, as if her aunt were standing beside her in the snow, nodding silently in approval. If you want more stories like this, subscribe and turn on notifications. Watch the next video and share this one with someone who might need it.